I'll welcome I'll welcome everybody again that is in the room here with us, and welcome everybody who's going to catch this later. We were just saying how wonderful it is to be able to see faces. We don't have residencies anymore, but we do get to do this weekly, and a number of you are showing up weekly, and hopefully those of you who are catching this later will be able to show up and do this live with us at some points along the way, because there's some benefit in being able to interact with each other live. There is another opportunity next week. In addition to the imagination session, which we have scheduled for next Wednesday, next Tuesday, we do have some students who are presenting on their research. This is the craft deliverable in each of your courses. 15-minute presentation. I sent an email message out to those 8 students who are presenting next week. And so if you're one of them, and a couple of you are, look for that email message with all the logistical stuff and everything in it about that. But if you're not one, you might want to show up just for this interaction and to learn from your fellow students and give them feedback. And you're welcome to do so. We're full at noon Central Time next Tuesday, and the links are on the in the course pass for that. But feel free to show up and cheer one another on and see what this is like, even if you're not going to be presenting to a later month. I think that's the end of my announcements, and we'll defer now to the Holy Reverend Father, Steve Trefz, for having our core faculty and core faculty mentors come in and talk about something they're passionate about. And Steve's doing that here today. I'm going to move you to speaker view, and we're ready to
I don't
listen.
know, Tony, I was catching every second or third word of yours, so I don't know if anybody else was also getting that or if it's on my end. Yeah, so you might have to go stand on the roof for.
I apologize. I will go move indoors while you're getting started.
All right, yeah. I just don't know if everybody caught your announcement is all. So if you want to type that up, I'm sure you will. But all right. Sounds good. And yeah. Well, okay. He's literally moving indoors right now. All right. Well, everybody, I'm Steve Trevz. I'll change my name here. Steven is my when I'm in trouble name that Zoom calls me. I don't know if anyone else has one of those, but I prefer Steve. Live here in Mitchell, South Dakota, in the United States of America. Mitchell is home to the world's only corn palace. For those who get a little bit bored during my presentation and want to look that up online, feel free to. We're a town of about, I'd say, 14,000 people, mostly agricultural, and I grew up on a farm in South Dakota, so that's kind of my wheelhouse. Been working with Kairos since before it was Kairos. Started at Sioux Falls Seminary in 2013 after I finished my Doctor of Ministry degree. Wife and I were serving churches nearby, and I asked if they had any availability to teach some classes and research methodologies or in the DMin program, and they said, sure thing, as long as you don't need any money. We got lots of opportunities, and so that's how I got my start in this awesome organization. Came along with Kairos somewhere at the end of 1.0 into 2.0. For those who don't know, those are the different curriculum iterations that we started 10 years ago or so in our master's programs. Work at the Wesley House of Study, so all of you who have any connection to any of the Pan Methodist, Wesleyan roots, I work with all the students, so maybe you got an email from me. Mostly the Masters of Divinity students are the main focus area of that, those working on their ordination or licensing pieces. But yeah, I also work with all sorts of students. I think I got 7 or 8 denominations of the 100 or so that are at Kairos in my wheelhouse. I have 35 students I serve as faculty mentor, along with the DMin program and other duties as assigned, which today is Augustana Mickelson Library accessing for faculty, which has been an interesting journey today. So talking about passion projects, for me, first, maybe it's a way of confession. So I'm a sports fan. And raise your hand if you're a sports fan. So I'll see how many minutes I want to take this analogy. So at least for 2 minutes then. So I'm a Bears fan and a Twins fan in football and baseball. So I I have a passion for the underdog, the one that always loses. In the Peanuts cartoon, getting the football pulled away from you every season right at the end, right? And growing up in a small school, I was the only kid in my class till junior high. We still had country schools. I mean, we're talking rural. So I've always kind of had this underdog 80s farm kid mentality. Where that entered into my faith journey was I went straight out of college into seminary at Garrett Evangelical in Chicago or in Evanston. Met my wife there. We're both pursuing ministry. About a year in, I realized that it wasn't exactly for me, but I didn't see any other way out or any other way in, or I didn't know there was options for doing ministry differently. After serving for about a year in the parish as a solo pastor, my wife serving at a different church, what time having our first child, having a slight mental breakdown. I say slight because at the time I thought it was a big one until later I realized what that might entail. And we just had a conversation about, the church is successful, the church is growing, people are coming, like all the metrics of doing my job well that I learned in the MDiv program are happening. So why does this feel like God's not a part of any of it? And just really digging into structures of the church, sociology of the church, history of the church, my own, psychology background, like what's not going on here, right? Why is redemption not a part of the story that we're having success with? Like we're hitting the metrics, but we're not hitting the gospel, it felt like. So made the decision to go on family leave, and it was during family leave to help raise Brady and then our second child, Henry, that I started my doctor of ministry program. And I didn't know what for. I just knew that I needed to get a doctorate someday eventually because I'm addicted to school. And I looked at different programs, psychology of religion, PhDs, and this area of rural sociology or whatever it might be. But felt the call to go back to my alma mater and do the DMin from a distance so I could still do the dad route. And I just really started asking questions, right? How long has our denomination been like this? How long has our conference been like this? How long has pastoring been like this? Just things that I didn't know, right? Exploring. About halfway through that first year of the DMin program, I stumbled across a book by Paulo Freire. Anyone come across Pedagogy of the Oppressed? I had a individualized mentor, a faculty mentor before we knew they had a name. And he was a local pastor in rural South Dakota, and he gave this book to me. And that's kind of the basis with where my project went. So what I want to do today is share like a 25 minute kind of rehash of what I learned and how I learned it, and then maybe lead into some question answers about what does this have to do with you and how do you finish your program well, and where I think there might be some connections. All right. So let me pull, can I share my screen legally? Yes, I can. Look at that. So this is a variation of the presentation I did to the Association of Doctor of Ministry Educators. It's kind of like DMIN's ATS group, right, of different things. And they invented an award for like best project, and I won it. And so I had to present at it in Chicago in an ice storm. So this was 10 years ago, and a lot has changed in methodology since then and in the data. But I think you'll kind of notice that some things have stayed the same. So I titled my project Picturing Lay Ministry. The key verse I had, and I don't know if you can see it there, if the green thing's in the way, but John chapter 1, verses 45 through 46 reads that Philip found Nathanael, said to him, we have found him about whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. Nathanael says to Philip, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. So growing up in rural South Dakota comes with a lot of people asking you, can anything good come from there? Um, the town of Nazareth around the time of Jesus's life and ministry and growing up was roughly the same population as the town I grew up in and went to high school in, just outside of my farm. And so when I found that out, when I was digging into some demographics of the Bible, I started looking a little more at the theological and spiritual connotations of this statement, right? Can anything good come out of a small place, a rural place, um, an insignificant percentage of the population, so to speak, a place where academics weren't necessarily known to come from, or even people finish high school. But I love the answer. Come and see for yourself. So, what is it about seeing for yourself that helps in the transformational aspects of ministry that I was interested in? So when I was setting up the problematic, I'm going to move this out of the way because it's driving me batty at the top of my screen. That connection I said to Paulo Freire, but also Martin Giese, who was a rural sociologist, I began to dig into these books and resources I had never had access to, or no one had really encouraged me to have access to in the sociology section, the rural sociology, the research methodologies section. And I began to come up with these continuous aha moments when I read about the oppressed mindset. Now, we're a majority culture. I mean, if you could be 102% white where I grew up, it's 102% white, right? And German, Russian background, maybe some Norwegian folks, but you couldn't get more like monoculture than we had operating. But within each church, these things kept popping up as I was trying to lead and pastor my church. This idea of life being largely beyond your control. This desire to work alone or independently, AKA, Pastor, I love small groups. That's a great idea for other people, right? That continual response to the things I was trying to do to build relational connections in my context. This pessimism that rural folks develop in order to protect themselves, right? How's the crops looking this year? Oh, probably not as good as last year. Well, if that's true, you're not disappointed. So again, planning for droughts, planning for blizzards, planning for floods, so that you're not disappointed, kind of beaten down by weather and life in the rural place. Carries into the church. Carrying an inflated view of self due to isolation. What does this look like? The fact that every neighbor I had was right about everything they ever talked about, whether or not they went to school or talked to anyone else in their lives. Because so many people lived in isolation, they had no reference points outside of their own perspective. People personally guarded with emotions, right? Not trusting, not risking that underbelly. That's so important to leave vulnerable if we're going to grow spiritually. And also refusal to see one's own neighbor as self. In the agricultural world, sure, we helped each other, but more often than not, when land came up for sale, our neighbor was our enemy or was a threat to us continuing to farm. It was a competition of who can stay and who can survive. So as I began to note these things, I started to see the connections of rural life and its challenges to the church. Competition for scarce land and resources. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a church that said, why are all the people going to that church? Or if we could only be like that church, we'd be successful, right? Instead of seeing other believers, right, living out the gospel, we see competition. Deadly habits fueled by isolation. When you want to be alone and you deal with things alone, drinking, drugs, pornography, affair, like the laundry list of personal sin is right at your disposal, right? And since you're in isolation, there's really little way to know how to share or to be noticed or to get help. Dangers of weather and travel needs. I was serving churches in a place where literally you couldn't be outside in certain times of the year or else you'd die. that has to be taken into account, right? I've been at church in Kona, Hawaii before where you could be outside every day, every Sunday and be just fine. But you needed a building, you needed heat. And with these things came cost, and church meant that you had to have certain support. And there was never enough. So the scarcity mindset fits in there too. And the fact that most of our neighbors were cash poor, millionaires, but not till they're dead type mentality when it comes to socioeconomics, right? Like you own land, but land doesn't buy you groceries. And you're indebted probably for most of the land and machinery. And so talking about stewardship with no cash flow, mandatory building costs, and all these things, this is what the church was thinking and talking about more than how do we do discipleship? How do we follow Jesus? So again, I just kept seeing over and over these symptoms of the oppressed mindset, and I can share this with you later. I'm not going to go through every slide, but I do want to hammer into this one thing that I learned through sociology and research methodology. It's that change really does pose, especially for rural places, a sociocultural risk. If you're going to advocate for a new way where there was no way, you're going to jeopardize social harmony that's been in existence sometimes for a century or more, right? You're going to polarize what little neighboring continues. And we see that in election cycles lately. We see that in all these conversations about particular issues. The risk of communicating with one another these days is felt even stronger in smaller population zones. So attempting to change in those is more dangerous. So, since I was coming into this with my whole life and energy and finances to do a project on initiating change in rural spaces, these were not the social and research demographic things that I wanted to find, right? I was finding some truths that were not overtly helpful to me at first, but again, it also gave me the courage because I knew it was really important. How did this show up amongst the laity? So those not clergy, not licensed, not deacon, those within the church who are the general members and the bulk of our congregations in my heritage. You saw the oppressed mindset, and I saw this serving the church, this lack of agency, perceived in real clergy definitions and roles. So that's the pastor's job. That's what we pay the pastor for. I can't do that. I never even went to college. I can't do that. I didn't train to be a pastor. So a learned helplessness that comes with an oppressed mindset. This once all-encompassing biblical nature of the laity as the body, living out the body of Christ. Laity had started to become a pejorative term within my discipline and within my peer group, right? This idea that the clergy matter, we're dealing with clergy issues, the laity need to just follow us. And again, in an oppressed mindset, social setting that can emerge over time and build, it's like the frog in the kettle. The frog will just sit there and enjoy the warm water until it's too hot, right? And then it's too late. These things aren't just overt at time, and they're often unnoticed because they happen over time. Also began to see that the laity had this disconnect between spiritual giftedness and actually being able to act out and live out your spiritual gifts. Like kind of this understanding that spiritual gifts meant you were called to be a pastor someday. So this real separation between the bulk and majority of the people in the pews and what could be possible in ministry for them. So my theory was, as I set up my project at a time when the world church needed a wealth of lay leadership, the realities of my cultural, both ethnic, geographical, and ecclesial barriers for accessing the spiritual gifts that they had all around them, overcoming that cultural boundary was going to be challenging. But yet I also have a firm belief, along with others, including Bownite, that there are sufficient spiritual gifts in every community of believers, regardless of size and place, to do what God is calling that community to do at this moment in time. God equips and calls those that God calls and equips. And I believe in a God that doesn't ignore spaces and places. And so what does that mean to where I was called to serve in rural Dakotas? Well, I began to believe that it requires that we got to find some way to help rural Christians see, embody their spiritual gifts in a different way, understand them in a different way, and the gifts in those around them, not just as categories on a page, a quiz, or a test you took, but possible actions already being lived out. I proposed that participants were going to develop a more positive, more contextualized understanding of spiritual gifts through a short-term photo voice experience. And this is kind of where I'm going to pause, and I'll bring everybody back if you're around. In that slide, I used like 7 words I'd never heard before I started my doctorate, right? So I don't know if that's where you're at in your presentations, or if you're mostly still in the words you already knew before you started paying us tuition. Let me see just a show of hands. Like, where are you at in your journeys? Just starting. Who's my just starting people? Okay, 1, 2, 3. How many of you are almost done? Like, the D is already engraved on your nameplate. Carl's got that. Okay. And Ray's like somewhere in between. David's somewhere in between, right? And you don't have to if you're doing other things. In no way did I expect that someone from England named Sarah Pink, who was doing social research with women in another Latino context, in another continent, was going to be the person Christ sent to change my life. And it happened in a library, as Christ often works through, right? For those of us who love books. But the reality was, I was just trying to figure out, how the heck do I ask good questions? How the heck do I work with participants, right? How do I find out if I'm just making this up, or what I think could happen is actually happening? And when I did a search for this word I heard in class called participatory action research, PAR, participatory action research. I was like, what is that? Like, it has its own acronym, and I've never heard of it before. So I had to dig into this. And basically, it's the research methodology that says you, as a facilitator, have a gift in front of you, and it's called the participants. And so any type of questioning, line of inquiry that takes those participants and gets them to help you come up with the questions that need answering, that helps you understand their culture, not just tell them what their culture is. Any line of inquiry like that is participatory action. You're getting a more grounded, Tony's favorite word, right? This grounded theory, this idea of people actually in the spaces telling you the truths about how they see the world. And you might see it differently as a researcher, but unless you acknowledge and let them give voice to that, the disconnect is going to remain, because you're talking in 2 different languages, right? And so as I looked more into photo voice, it was this amazing methodology where you give a group of people in a setting an assignment to bring back photographs. Like, and back in the day, this was, we're still at flip phones operating in 2013, right? It's you can do it in different ways now, but you got to be careful about how you ask for it. Like, handheld photos that they can show, right, to everybody else in the group. And everybody here know what the number one fear in the world is, right? What's the number one fear?
Public speaking.
Public speaking. So then you got this guy who nobody knows asking a new group of people to come into this retreat setting and talk and share a testimony, right? That's an invitation to get rural people to not only be quiet, but also drive away when you think they're going on a bathroom break. So photo voice is just genius. Because instead of giving a speech about a concept, literally people just point to the picture and tell people in the group what's in the picture, what's happening in this. And, when you're pointing at something, what do you not have to do? Look at everybody, right? So it takes some of the fear out. You're also getting detailed descriptions of the behind the scenes of that still life landscape, right? Because every picture is just a snapshot. But when you give a description of what's going on there, you get the story of why that soup kitchen was happening, or why we were at the school gymnasium that day, or why, right? You get the testimonies, you get the accounts. And so what Pink and Firenze and some other people had done with Photo Voice was it was helping these small oppressed minority groups within different communities in different contexts. It was helping them notice what was actually happening all around them, but nobody wanted to say out loud, or nobody wanted to admit was happening, or just had happened so slowly over time nobody knew how to explain it. So whether it was females living within an oppressed community of abuse or mistreatment, whether it was an educational system that had left a certain group behind, it's a way to help add strength to another's arm, right? The biblical phrase, to people suffering in an oppressed mindset for whatever reason that happened. Because then, as they describe the photos, they begin to take ownership of the setting and the context themselves. They begin to see places of hope, places of encouragement, and in my mind, potentially places of ministry that they hadn't named as ministry before. So I invited folks to these different one-day discernment retreats. I had this theory, right? And so I'm now going to test it. I invited folks who had felt a nudge or felt a call or wanted to explore more of their spiritual gifts or what God was doing in their lives. And I held 5 trainings across North and South Dakota and Minnesota. And the main thing that we did was take a spiritual gifts inventory that our denomination had been using, look at the results, right? Have food, because that's important in rural cultures as well. Then I had everyone take a pre test, basically, with 8 questions on a Likert scale. Their attitudes about spiritual gifts, their attitudes about ministry, pastor, words like that. And then we did the photo voice, and then I did a post test. And what I learned was I should have got more input on my questions, because of the 8 questions or Likert scale responses, 7 of them were absolute doo-doo, and whatever your culturally appropriate word for that is in your setting. But I didn't know that until afterwards, and honestly, the people working with me didn't really know either till we tried it. But the one that did show significant statistical movement across the 70 or so participants I had was they began to see a different definition of minister. So literally what Photo Voice did, they were encouraged to bring 7 photos of where they saw ministry in their community. So 70 times 7 is what, 490 pictures roughly? In 490 pictures, there was only 1 picture that had reference to a pastor. Now think about that for a second. Everything they speak out loud, everything they act out loud says a different narrative. But when given the opportunity to just give some sort of testimony to their own space, I didn't point that out until the end, right? Usually the end of the day even, and I'd say, hey, did you notice anything weird about the pictures? And of those 1 picture that had a pastor in it, it was because the pastor's desk was so messy that the person said, how can the pastor do all the work of the church? Look at they can't even get their office straightened. So for the most part, every participant left using the word ministry differently than when they'd started the day. So when I talk about what's my passion for this, why is it worth hitting the library a couple extra shelves past where you intended? When it's trying to get into the mind of the audience that you're creating this project for, when it's trying to figure out where in your research might it be important to actually get their perspective, not just put it on them. I can't say enough about how these research methods and these testimonies of these sociologists changed my life and the lives of those that I've worked with since. I mean, part of me getting to Kairos and helping Kairos become Kairos is because I learned the pedagogy throughout this process, right? I saw lives transformed in spaces where we've been told since John 1, nothing can be transformed from there. And I realized how important it is to stick up and say, yes, it can. right? The end of that scripture I shared with you. So I got like 30 other slides with all the stats and data. If you're interested in the math of it and how to do a chi-squared test on a small participant group when your n's under 1,000, I'd love to talk to you because that's my secret shame. I love math and calculus and all that stuff. And I ran my own numbers and it was glorious. But the reality is the spirit in the room also told me everything I needed to know. So that qualitative work, right? Listening to stories, transcribing well, theme analysis, all these things when shared back to the people I worked with, because that's the other part of PAR, the power of sharing what you've learned from them with them equips them to do the same thing, right? And so I don't know, Tony, that's kind of my Cliff's Notes version of how research methodologies changed my life and ministry. But any questions at this point or thoughts? Or I got a few that I'm going to give everybody else when we go from there. But yeah.
That was awesome on two levels, Steve. One is the content. Interestingly, Jonathan, you may have known that John Lemaster Smith came in and talked about rural ministry a
Yeah.
couple weeks
Okay.
ago too. So there's a thread that's being woven in here a little bit. But I loved how you brought the research methodologies in. A number of students are getting to that part of their course, and we're asking them this time around to experiment research methods a little bit. So I love you guys can respond and interact with Steve in either piece of this, but the research piece I think might be particularly helpful to some here that haven't heard some of these terms and these processes before.
Yeah. Let me on that line, can I pull up one more slide before we get to questions? And I see there's some things in the chat. Another person, if you don't know where to start, is Clifford Geertz. I was really taken aback by life as a collage. And as Kairosians against the banking model of education, right? And this was all brand new when I was cranking it out in my context 10, 15 years ago. It's starting to get some rhythm now, I think, right? In the greater world of education. So banking model, correct me, Tony, if I'm off base, but I understand that to be kind of like a savings account at a bank, right? You put everything into some place and you assume it grows and is useful over time. So the banking model of education would be I show up, I give you a 50-minute lecture, you take my wisdom back and make it beautiful, right? Like I'm banking something into your brain that your brain then has deposited and to use. And education will always have some of that. But when you start talking about the rural space as a collage, and what that means is unlike a still life painting, there's unfixed edges in real life, right? There's blurred boundaries between neighbors. There's ill-defined spaces with others, friend or foe, trust or not, hurt me before I hurt them, right? And so ministry takes place in a collage. It's never a repeatable, generalizable, to use methodology terms, moment. There's always nuance. There's always the spirit doing something new. And it might be familiar methods, and it might be the classic scriptures or hymns or what have you, but there's always something to be observed and to recognize as holy in each interaction. So partly what happens when you have an oppressed mindset is you get stuck seeing the world around you only as that still life landscape. It's a deterministic view of this is my spot. This is what will happen. I got to figure out how to make this good enough. And it's a lie, really. But being somebody who grew up and believed that lie for several decades, it's a powerful lie and it has some validity. So, yeah. So I just wanted to share that Geertz piece because I'd never heard of him before. And there's others, like I said, Sarah Pink, Carolyn Wong, or yeah, there's just, yeah, I can get more resources to you if you're interested. But yeah, questions, thoughts, things you want to hear more about? What did we have for lunch at the retreat? Because that is important, things like that.
Well, I'm not a preacher, and people should be very grateful for that. I'm a teacher. I teach. I do go around to churches across a lot of denominations, and I've seen a lot of what you are talking about
Hmm.
because I live in a very rural setting, like extremely rural.
Okay.
So all of the challenges that you're talking about, I mean, every one of them is hitting home with me. And one of the things that I noticed over the course of 15 years, predominantly within the Wesleyan tradition, but outside of that as well, is the, well, that's not my job, that's the pastor's job. And it isn't an unwillingness to accept responsibility, because farmers have no problem taking things on their shoulders. In fact, they usually have too much on their shoulders. But what I found was that it was they when discipleship is discussed, it's a this is the what, these are the tasks, and there's never any kind of existential understanding of, and there's an identity that comes along with being a new creation. It's all just, well, I'm in the club now. I'm part of this group. I've been accepted into the community, which is always good. And now I have to do these things, and I can do that, but I'm not necessarily as different, and I don't take on to myself the the identity of a disciple or a priest of Jesus, or any of these biblical terms that really are never embraced or even engaged at all. And what I found is there's no expectation in the church that they do so. And that was really disturbing, because that led me to the teacher in the church and saying, where is the education in the area of identity? And so that led some of my pre-Kairos work, where I wrote on identity because of that, because I saw a lot of the same things that you mentioned.
Yeah, and so Reese, the beauty of like another one to write down if you haven't heard of it yet is Sage, SAGE. And again, these are secular sociology sites, but such a resource. I saw we have on the DTL now, a connection to their database. And yeah, any of you working with something you see that they don't, any research methodologies designed around change, oppressed, power differential, right? Because what I discovered too, like you said, it takes two to tango, right? Oppressed mindset comes from oppressors. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that was the clergy class. Partly because of the assumptions of the cultures that they were trying to meet, partly because of internal identity work the pastors hadn't done, right? I'm probably not the only one who's gotten into that trouble before, but that self-awareness can't be forced on people, right? Just like discipleship can't be forced on people, but self-awareness can occur. So what are the ways people have curriculum action research is another great field that's studying transformational pedagogy, right? What's the best way to work with different cultures around awareness raising, right? So yeah, good points. Other thoughts or things you want to know more about?
I'm going to go ahead and step out on a limb here. My name is Drew. Can you
Yeah.
hear me okay? Hey, guys. It's so nice to see some of your faces. Ray, good to see you, man. It's fun chatting with you.
Yeah.
So, Steve, one of the things that I've always been curious about, and something that I'm going to be doing, or hopefully be doing my dissertation on, is men's groups and kind of the connection there. And one of the big ones is that I found when I entered into a period of sobriety, which I'm still in, thank the Lord,
Awesome.
for the last 5.5 years, the stark difference between Alcoholics Anonymous and the church in terms of how much I know what I've been saved from, the idea of a felt need. And I've done an extensive amount of journaling on this and looking into it and just saying, okay, for my dissertation to talk about. I want to create a philosophical framework that can apply to any church. So Carl could take this into his church and say, this would just apply. Men need this. They need vision, they need legacy, they need a people to serve, and they need something to do. I think Carl would agree that if he had a group like that to give to his guys, wrap it around his theology. So what we need in the church, I think, is a new philosophy for this. So I want to look at some parts of this, but do like a personal case study of what it was that I in fact experienced, right?
Mhm.
What was it? Is that something that can be used in a methodological setting? Is it appropriate? I have a pretty deep knowledge of both systems pretty well. And how could I do that in a case study perspective, or just, that kind of thing? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it does. So I'm going to give you the Kairos answer, right? Because I know we're being recorded. The appropriateness of any methodology is determined by your mentor team.
Okay.
And follows the design and paradigms of your degree, right? So for instance, if I have a bachelor's student and a bachelor's MDiv blend student, those two students have to follow different ways of describing and delivering upon the same outcomes. So, and of course, this is my job and I do it every day, but I'm blanking on the name of the methodology that is the one person kind of self case study review.
Yeah, it's like ethnocentrism or
On
something like that.
autoethnography.
Ethnography. There it is. Okay.
Autoethnography. That's it. Thank you, Tony.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Blair.
I was frantically trying to Google search the term to not look like I didn't know what I was talking about. And I'm like, this is just going to take me to things that are not helpful to anybody. So yeah, no, autoethnography, because that was, so here's what I tell my sociology students when I teach the intro college class, which is a hoot to see the post-COVID Gen Z, post-Gen Z version of that I've had this semester. But what I tell them is 80% of what I'm going to teach you this semester would have been laughed at 25 years ago, right? When America was in the real strongest crux of it, quantitative or else phase when it came to research, right?
Yeah.
Just the facts, numbers. If I can't add it up, if I can't average it to a mean, it doesn't exist as truth. Qualitative research had just begun to get published when I was doing mine 10, 15 years ago, right? So we were on the, think these researchers were almost like the middle schoolers doing their middle school 8th grade capstone project.
Mm-hmm.
And their teacher was still the seminal person right behind it in the school with them, right? So this was their dissertations I was reading. And so autoethnography, I mean, that's the very last one to get credence. Because how do you, we were so worried about, you're talking about generalization, right? I want something that I can share with another place that they can do, and it'll be as successful. And autoethnography, for the most part, can't guarantee any generalization. Right?
Yep.
But what it can guarantee is a testimony that says this inquiry is worth trying in your place.
Yes.
And so what you might end up doing, and my suggestion would be, can you develop a repeatable path of inquiry for another person to do in their setting? And that's what I ended up doing, right? I set up the parameters and I said, photo voice is great. The only thing I can really tell you to do is if you got a group of people that cannot identify out loud or really feel or identify with what's actually going on in your community, have them describe to each other what's going on in their community, and it'll appear.
Yeah, and that's one of the main things I want to look at in the dissertation. And sorry, anybody can just jump in at this point, but it's that it seems to me that men's pastors specifically think that their guys are doing okay, and that the guys aren't actually doing okay. And there's this huge disconnect between why does a guy have to say I'm an alcoholic or an addict before people think that there's a felt need?
Yeah.
In my mind, the felt need is there if they say they've got $400,000 of debt to the IRS, if they say that they've got an addiction to pornography, if they say that they can't control their eating, right? There's a felt need there, but a lot of times we just don't know how to associate. So how much do men's pastors actually, how much do their men really belong? And how much do their men actually feel like they actually belong? And trying to get to some answers there. And I thought that my, from an ethnography perspective, just saying, what was it phenomenologically when I walked into AA that I just stopped drinking?
Yeah.
Because there
And I
was
was
a
gonna,
thing. And yeah,
I was gonna add that one of my resource methodology texts in my bibliography is the AA
Mhm.
book, you know, the
Yeah.
handbook. That was something that I came across as whenever my mentors would remind me that a 1-day retreat does not a transformed disciple make, which is not what I want to hear as somebody who does not have the patience of a normal adult human. Or maybe I do. Maybe that's where we're all at. But really looking through the coaching aspect that I gleaned from the AA route
Yeah.
of coaching.
Sponsorship.
Yeah, coaching people, mentoring people into self-awareness.
Yes.
But also, and I don't know if you've experienced this, one of the things we've experienced in my context, I was specifically looking at how AA in my setting had become a substitute for mission and congregational interaction, right? Like you went to AA or you went to church. And why was
Right.
or there and where did that come from? And it became to, because if you look at the importance of things from Nancy Ammerman's first look at congregational life, there's activities, there's artifacts, and there's accounts. And in a cultural setting like mine, where worship had no space for testimony or accounts outside of the pastor's message,
Mhm.
people need to give account to what's both confession and praise. And
Yeah, I reckon that too. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And if I hear a pastor preach who doesn't give the word of their testimony, experience, strength, and hope, the message always feels devoid. So thank you. I'll let you go. I don't want to
Sounds
take
good.
up anyone else more time. Thank you so much for jumping in. Answered a ton of questions. Tony, can't wait to talk to you later. All right, thanks, guys.
Yeah, cool. Other thoughts? Yeah, David.
Yeah, Steve, I think this connects, but I'm not exactly sure how. When you were describing your rural context, what occurred to me as I was reading and I took notes of your different characteristics, working alone, pessimism, and so forth. It seems to me that how it was hitting me was it goes beyond landscape into a personal landscape. I mean, there are many of us who feel distanced. We could put that as a rural thing. And I recognize these same characteristics. And so I think what you're doing actually can go far beyond, and I'm sure it does go far beyond kind of the geographical descriptor into actually human experience of experiencing some sense of distance. So just thought I'd add that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm going to pull up one more slide because this came up in the doctor of ministry stuff we've been kicking around this week too. A couple of the implications from 10 years ago that I think still ring true. A short term anything can still be impactful as long as it's culturally intentional. When I got hired, I wanted my name to be professor of intentional ministry. And they said, well, we can't have on the website the implication that none of the other professors are intentional. And I was like, oh no, that's a good point. But what if they're not? No. And then that was a different conversation. But no, really getting into this, if you're doing ministry unintentionally in a world where we have all access to all these different data projects, DMin, dissertate, like people have tried what we're trying in different settings and in different ways. It's my job as an ordained pastor to take care of that. And I'm on a meeting. Yeah. So yeah, really digging into that. Anything short term is worth it as an intervention, as long as it's intentional. But this piece, helping participants find a voice, right? In this online identity generation. Like I have a student in my sociology intro class. He's a freshman, comes from North Dakota, one of the bigger towns there. And he has 2 phones and an iPad with him at all times because each one has a different profile of him. And he's checking all his socials and these different identities of, track, more rap fan, artist. And it's just easier, he said, to have the different devices for his different selves. And just think about the isolation is enough with one of us. But if you had yourself split into 3 versions of you, that's triple the isolation. And at least in my opinion, some of the things we're working on. So I don't know if that helps or connects, but post-COVID, everybody got a taste of rural life and was deemed bad. And we can't talk about what was good because everything else is supposed to be pessimistic about it, right? And so we have the same cultural piece to that too. Like, does that get what you're talking about, David? I don't know if I blew past your question or not. What do you think?
No, that was good. It is an identity thing. It's an identity experience. And it can be rural, I think, even in a major city.
Yeah. Yeah, rural's a cultural mindset in the new era, right? When less and less people actually farm the land or raise the animals or proteins, as it's called now. So, and, I did have the question, would my project just be a camp high? Do you ever have that in your context, the camp high? You go to summer camp and you come back and you're just going to slice the world and bake a cake. And then 2 weeks later, you're back to whatever pile of things you didn't get done while you were at camp, or your boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with you, or yeah. So that was the question I had. The cool thing about this, what we're seeing is that I can't think of anyone that I've had in the 5 years of retreats that I ran that didn't pursue ministry either in their vocation as a teacher, a banker, social worker, retiree, or pursue, like I have one person start Kairos MDiv and is running his hometown church. Now he's retired from database engineering 10 years after we had that first retreat. And it was all because he's realized, well, my pastor's no better than me. Which is sometimes scary to think about, but also very multiplyingly awesome. So yeah, Tony or Steve or whoever.
Yes,
No,
hi, Steve.
Yeah, I'll defer to the students always on this. I was going to go off on a tangent.
Well, I just have a very quick question. The first 15 minutes I was on with my iPhone, it was breaking up a little bit. You referenced a author researcher. Was that Paulo Freire from Brazil?
Yeah. So also known
What about
as controversial communist revolutionary, yeah. But also yeah, really good early interventionist missiologist in his own right. Well, political missiologist. So I think that's how you spell it. The I and the E might be around. Carl. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking about kind of Paulo Freire is, I mean, I really like that book. I think that it's got a lot to say, even though it was probably, like, say, communist Marxist. And he actually was exiled for 13 years. But it kind of comes into play. And I'm thinking about and kind of the disconnect that we have in our churches with our culture, with our American culture. Where I live, I see probably a bigger disconnect than where you live, as we're the most underchurched place in America. And so with that and dealing with that, so we deal with some different things that other people won't necessarily deal with. But kind of going back to the idea of, finding out the church, assuming where it is that people live or what a people's space is very difficult. And so you kind of find the idea of what you're talking about, and it comes back to Freire's work when you talk about asking the people what it is that they need. Or we almost think in lines of a dissertation. Well, I've got to come up with this, with this bullet, with this question, that this, that this unsolvable thing that I'm going to solve. And yet you find that that is just, that's just you. But the idea is then going back to pedagogy of the oppressed is the idea of it's the voices of the people that really give structure to the culture in which they're living. They are the culture in which they're living. You're a part of it, but sometimes you can see yourself distant from that because you're a pastor, or you think that, well, I'm clergy and they're not, so there's a separation.
Yeah.
But really where the church has got to make the impact is in the midst of whatever their cultural reality is. And I think that kind of comes back down to the idea of giving the voice to people that need the voice, because they're going to tell you what they need. So when we talk about, and Drew was talking about, well, men having a problem with pornography or gambling or whatever the case might be, sometimes what happens is that we often can be in a position where, it's almost like we marginalize them because they've got a problem with pornography or because they're an addict. And so we don't give them the safe space to be able to say, this is my reality where I live, but it's not just me. There's other people that are involved in it. And so how is it that we then constructively build a community that on discipleship, kind of an odd term to use, I think, so a community that is developing spiritually and emotionally and intellectually at the same time. Maybe I'm saying too much to basically say this. I think there's a disconnect between what we sometimes assume as a church and what it is that the people are really the ones that are asking the questions that they need the answers that maybe only they can provide, and we as clergy can't even provide. I don't even know if any of that even makes sense.
Yeah. Where are you calling in from, Carl? Remind me.
San Jose, California.
San
So I
Jose.
live
Okay.
in Northern California.
Yep. Been there a few times. The thing that popped into my head as I was kind of thinking, listening through your answer was, if any of you are working on time in your projects, what does it mean to recapture intentional time with each other beyond a small group curriculum? The first step is you got to have time to actually listen and talk to each other, right? I think about the times in the last couple of years when I've offered the same retreat over Zoom, in the room, some people in the room, some people on Zoom. It is almost impossible to get people to come 2 days in a row to anything, right? Compared to 10 years ago. And it wasn't easy then. And so part of it's like realizing in your context, well, what are they committing time to? They're saying yes to some things. What are they? What message are they receiving, or what invitation are they receiving from them that's making them say yes, right? It's
Well, yeah, an interesting thing about that, to bring that up, and then I'll give room space for others, is that in the community that I live, you don't even go up to a part of your congregation, maybe one of the members of your church. You don't even go up to their door before calling them and asking permission. You don't knock on the door.
yeah.
And so even the idea of having home groups, the churches by and large where we live are not open to having home groups. And part of that is because it's kind of a violent community that I live in and where I pastor. But the idea is there's this isolation that's happening. So it's difficult for us really to work out small groups where you might be able to work it out, maybe in somewhere that was a little more conservative than where we liberally are. So, we're caught in this struggle with churches of really kind of finding out what is it that people need by and large for the church to even survive. Because we're finding that, in a lot of cases, since COVID, the amount of churches that's closed down in our area is staggering. But then the people end up not going to church after their churches leave. And so there's even this bigger disconnect.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is what's happening here is, coming to a theater near you, whether it's 10 years removed or 25 years removed, which kind of speaks to a community like ours, might sound an alarm of saying, where are we really going when we talk about ministry and the construct of what the church ought to be going forward in the future?
Yeah. I love it. I got some more thoughts, but I saw one more hand and then all the squares moved. Drew, go for it.
Yeah, so for me, in my context, one of the things that I'm trying to work through as part of my research is giving the answer to what it means to have this isolation and meaningless. This is something I think we're kind of all working towards, the thing in the culture, right?
Yep.
And one of the ways that I've tried to move in my own church as an assistant minister is kind of get people to understand that we have our own culture. And so I worry less about whether we're fitting in or meeting people in the culture around us, and whether or not we're embodying the culture that we already have, that we've already set out. And as a sacramental kind of liturgical church, I've tried to invest this idea that the way we do things physically matter as much as the way we think about things. And so I want people to worry less about having the right theology and more about doing things the right way. And is that incompatible with this idea of meeting the culture where it's at, in your opinion?
No, I mean, you watch any advertisements for, 10 minutes any night on your TV, and it's people trying to sell you on a new practice that'll change your life, right? Whether it's exercise, diet, cryo freeze, bio freeze, nano freeze, whatever it is, right? Nanobots, download your brain. So there's long methodological resources available to us on what helps ingrain practices, right? Why does Weight Watchers not work and yet make money, and then not make money during this last iteration, and then try to change and make less money and then go back to what they were doing, right? We talked about this morning in the Doctor of Ministry session. Don't overlook marketing researchers. I mean, they're pumping millions into the same questions you're asking. You might have a Jesus slant where they don't, but their answers are still true, right? When they ask people what they're looking for, it's the same answer you're going to get. So find those sites, find those, think tank labs. That's a great place to maybe, what are they, think of some of the places even that are trying to sell people on new practices to change their lives, and figure out where sacrament, how would you pitch that differently and why? I've seen people do fun stuff with that. The other thing I would say is, the banking model assumed that if we give people the right answers, eventually they'll live the right lives. I think what I'm trying to articulate is, until you know where people are and meet them there, so that they know that you care about what they're excited and frustrated with, the next generations don't care what we have to say, no matter how true it is, right? Or how right it is. That's just been my experience. So does that kind of get at what you're asking, Drew? So again, the goal of Photo Voice is not to define our ministry based on what everybody had in their pictures. It's to prove that Jesus was already at work in their lives in ways they were dismissing or ignoring or unable to see. And I think anytime we can help people see the inbreaking of the Spirit where they are, whatever we're talking about will follow from there. But some of that's theological too, right? There's also, maybe some people on the call that some of the texts I read were, spiritual gifts ended, with the sending of the 12 or whatever, so again, all sorts of theological conversations you can have, all sorts of socio-cultural. I think my main goal today was to point out, don't let the curriculum or other authors trick you into thinking that socio-cultural has nothing to do with divine. Methodology has just as much Jesus in it as the Bible does, if you let it, if you invite Jesus into it. That's kind of my testimony. So I don't know if that answered your question at all, Drew. I wasn't thinking about it.
No, the divine energy of God flows through the physical world to offer a means of grace, and that probably includes methodologies and textbooks and doctorate of ministry professors.
And and the body and blood of Christ, right? And that's where Ammerman's work around sacrament as artifact, activity, and account can be triunely transformative if you can walk with people long enough and probably individually enough to help them see why that is. You know, that's the other trick, right? As people become more and more isolated, those of us leading ministries are more and more charged with one-on-one time. I don't know if you've noticed, but that takes longer than group conversations, right? Or group lectures. The reason banking model is the way to do education is because you only need one person to teach 200 people and call it done, right? One-on-one faculty mentoring, discipleship pastoring. Part of that is how do we adapt our economy of scale to that reality? But it's good. Then if you're part of a denomination that's got some rules and regulations around sacrament, like me, then you get somebody coming up to ask to get rebaptized and your polity doesn't allow for it, but 200 people are staring at you and this lady's in tears. Then you have another qualitative data point to bring to the group about where God was moving, right? That's the beauty of experiential methodology. Tony.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks, Steve. I really appreciate that. Part of what we're trying to communicate by doing these research projects is that research is a philosophical choice. You're making it a theological choice, not just a practical choice. It's not just how can I get the best data.
Yeah.
It's how do I honor the people whose experiences will comprise what I'm trying to learn from them. And what's the best way to do that in a way that is honoring to them, does not exploit them, which is why we have this whole big piece on the ethics of research. So thank you for turning it from something that is merely practical into something that is both ethical and philosophical, and then going even the final step here and turning it into something that is an exercise in theology.
That's good.
Sacramento. I really appreciate that. I don't know that I've heard anybody do that before. Awesome.
Yeah, it's good. And like I said, you can always get a hold of me through the website. I think my face and email's on there, or through kairos.edu, or if you want to connect, odds are I know your mentors. So it's the other thing, you know, if you have questions about my resources or need more I'm realizing this week that it's time to update some bibliographies that I've been leaning on for a while across my sociology skills. So
Steve, I would invite you and I would invite students. We're going to wrap up now, but we have this messy collection of research sources and resources available on what we're calling the Imagining Research course path. It's not a course, it's just supplemental materials to help you with this. And you're invited to contribute to that. At some point, I want to get somebody who's really expert in all this stuff to go in and clean it all up and make it all nice and tidy. Right now, it's more like a collection. But Steve, you know this stuff well. Feel free to add your stuff to it. Students, you know, good sources or whatever, you know, send them on. We'll add them to it and continue to build that over time.
Sounds great.
And for those of you that could not hear the announcement I made at the beginning because my internet connection wasn't strong, we have our first student research presentations a week from today, Tuesday at noon. The link, by the way, is on each of the course paths that you're in. Just go into Connections and Recordings Unit, and you'll see October 29th, noon, and there'll be a link there to the Zoom room that we'll be in. So you're welcome to come in and pop in. It's full, so we've taken as many. There will be 8 students presenting there, but so if you want to schedule, do so in November, December, or further out. But come in and support your fellow students and see what these presentations look like. Thanks.
Tony, are you going to record that too?
I will record that. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll post it there. Yes.
And what kind of noon is that? Is that
That's
the kind of noon where
Central
you
Time.
live? Pardon me?
The Central Time.
You're talking Central Time.
I try to put all the time Sioux Falls time as the home base.
correct time. I'm just putting one more thing in the chat before you log off. If you haven't seen this book yet and any of your outcomes, it's one we're adding to the doctor of ministry side of the party. It's called Challenging Tradition, Innovation, and Advanced Theological Education. So it's a more multi-continent, multicultural look at how people are doing dissertations and projects these days. So it's got some editors, and I know Larry Caldwell from Kairos has a chapter in there, but I don't think he gets any money if you buy it. But yeah, if you want to check that out, it is on our DTL as well electronically. So again, if you want to kind of, if something's calling for a little outside the box, that's kind of a fun way to see how the Spirit was moving in those projects. All right. I can stick around too if anybody has any questions for a little bit, but it's up to you, Tony.
I'm going to stop recording. And we will post this as is. Weird, just that my recording button went away. There it is.